Hello, the Plumbing Council is here in studio with Professor Robert Bruno, Director of the Labor Education Program at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois. Bob and I first met in the mid-1990s when I was with UFCW. Bob had first joined the U of I's department. Bob is a highly regarded and popular speaker at labor union events and seminars, and is equally respected and welcomed by employer organizations, including, of course, signatory trade associations such as the PCA and PAMCANI. Bob often appears on such programs as WTTW's Chicago Tonight, and his assessment of labor unions and workplace issues is frequently sought by print and broadcast journalists throughout the country, and of course right here in Northern Illinois. I'll ask Professor Robert Bruno to give us a briefing on his upbringing and education, as well as a rundown of the books he's authored, several of the studies and projects that he's led, and the current state of the Labor Education Department at the University of Illinois. First of all, welcome, Bob, and let's start with your background.
Well, thanks for having me here. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. My father was a steel worker. My mother worked in factories and in office support jobs, and I spent most of my summers working in steel mills and aluminum factories to help pay for college education. So I come here today with a real solid blue-collar background.
Absolutely. Now, a number of the books that you've authored, why don't you just give me a rundown of some of the titles?
Yeah, so the first book was called Steelworker Alley, which looked at growing up in a working-class community in Youngstown, Ohio. Second book looked at the Teamsters Union in Chicago. It was really a study about how a union transformed itself into a very democratic institution. And then the third book looked at the role of faith and religious practices in the lives of working class people of diverse religious beliefs in and around Chicago.
Interesting. And now the department. Give me a little bit of a rundown of what the department does and where it's heading.
So the department has faculty in Urbana and in Chicago, and it's focused on work and employment relations. It looks at collective bargaining. It looks at labor unions as institutions. The program is beginning to generate a lot more research, applied research, having to do with public policy that impacts the workplace, in addition to doing an awful lot of extension and on-campus teaching to undergraduates.
Interesting. Our contractors, PAMCANI and PCA, are signatory to Plumbers Local 130. It's a collective bargaining agreement, obviously, and we continue to see growth, unfortunately, in the non-union sector. All the construction trades in the Midwest are facing this. Here in Greater Chicagoland, we're estimating that our union market share is at about 15%. Mm-hmm. With the amount of work that's being done, that's still significant. Do you concur with this figure, and what is your impression of where this percentage of union market share is going to be heading, up or down?
Well, you know, in the years that I've actually worked with the plumbing contractors and local plumbing unions, it's actually kind of surprising that the number is at 15%. I think it's a little concerning, and I would imagine that unless there's a real conscious effort to sort of get control of cost, to get control of where markets are growing, that number could continue to slip away. I mean, I wouldn't take anything for granted, and it is alarming on an historical basis that number has dropped to where it is. And you're probably a little bit stronger in certain areas than you are in others, but I don't think it should be taken for granted. It ought to be priority one to bump that number up.
Right, and I would say that the local is working very hard to organize. We're trying to bring new blood into the apprenticeship program. We started a new program with the Scouts to get those kids into an interest in getting involved in the apprenticeship program. So we're hopeful that it'll start rising. One key issue, obviously, that is on the minds of our industry is right-to-work legislation. It's now effective in, I believe, 24 states in the U.S. Proponents of right-to-work legislation claim that mandatory payment of union dues is unfair, and conversely that merit shops, meaning non-union, are vital to competitiveness. On the other hand, the opponents to right to work point to studies that show a reduction in overall compensation and a lower standard of living. I know you're very well versed in this area, so I'd like to get your comments on right to work.
So we have done our own studies here in Illinois. Illinois has never been a right to work state. It's a strong collective bargaining state. So we did a prospective study to determine, well, what would happen if we changed the policy here? And when we looked at a variety of variables, the results are actually quite negative. Worker wages will fall. The percentage of workers who will have health care and retirement benefits will drop. There will be additional fatalities on the job. There will be less tax dollars available in the state. The state's economy will shrink, which will put more pressure on the state budget to now take care of individuals. And interesting enough, we find that employers in right-to-work states actually earn less than employers in collective bargaining states. So nobody wins. when you implement right to work. And our studies are consistent with studies that have been done everywhere else in the 24 states that have that have right to work. It is harmful, not just for the workers, but it's harmful for the communities and the overall economy of the state.
Interesting. Governor Rauner, as we're recording this, is very new in office. As a matter of fact, just over a month. And he announced his desire to create what's called right-to-work zones and do away with some fair share dues requirements. Do you see this as a first shot, and do you expect more of this from this administration?
Well, it was certainly a pretty dramatic first punch right out of the gate, and so it does suggest that there's a bigger agenda and that there would be additional attacks on other public policy areas, attacking prevailing wage, attacking project labor agreements, looking for ways to restrict collective bargaining rights the way they were done in Wisconsin for public sector workers, perhaps moving from right-to-work zones to, at some point, thinking about turning the state into right-to-work. So I doubt that this is just a one-off effort. I believe it's part of an overall plan to push back against working-class families and the institutions and employers that represent them so well.
We'll keep an eye on that. What trends do you believe employers, particularly ours, signatory to a union contract, should be paying attention to right now and in the future?
So I think two areas should always be a big concern. One is to continue to offer the kind of high-quality workers that you do. I mean, your apprenticeship programs are world-class. This is where some of the best adult education is actually occurring, and I know the investment is quite heavy into those programs. So making sure that those apprenticeship programs have the best instructors and that you're creative in the classroom and you're providing the best training and you're keeping skill level up. The other area, I think, would be around licensing, would be around testing. I think a lot of conservative political forces out there would like to push the state back and get it out of the business of regulating and licensing work. And I think that's very harmful because that puts the consumer at risk, but it also means that low-wage, less well-trained, and quite frankly, sort of low-wage, low-road contractors can get into the market. And I think you need to preserve those rules, those regulations, and those licensing requirements.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm S.J. Peters for Plumbing Council in studio. Thanks to Professor Bruno.